Hi everyone, my name's Danielle Harris and I'll be taking you through the survey design lectures of the online distance course. We've broken the survey design lectures into 3 parts, so I'll be taking you through each of those in turn. And we're pointing you to Chapter 7 of the 2001 Introduction to Distance Sampling book, and also Chapter 2 of the 2015 book. So you'll find a lot more information about all of the topics I'll mention in those 2 chapters. And so in this first lecture we'll cover an introduction to survey design. We'll then think about point transect designs, followed by line transect designs, and finally a little bit about stratification towards the end of this lecture. So when designing a survey there are multiple things to consider. And firstly and most importantly, it's important to ask what are your objectives of the survey? And what precision do you need? So even if you can design a survey that will generate density estimates, will those density estimates be precise enough for you to be able to answer the questions that you're ultimately interested in asking? And what resources are required in order to achieve those objectives and that precision? And do you have sufficient resources available to you? And one such resource is thinking about training of observers. So we'd always advise that you include training in your budgets, and also to think about costing for statistical advice. And this will avoid the problem of getting to the end of your data collection and realizing that perhaps you should have designed your survey slightly differently in order to achieve your objectives. So thinking about the analysis and thinking about the stats whilst you're designing your survey can be a very useful thing to do. And also we'd advise you to conduct a pilot survey. Even if you don't conduct a pilot survey, you may well find that your first round of data collection inadvertently becomes that pilot survey, just because you learn as you go and protocols may change. And so that's why thinking about a pilot survey is a really good idea and will help you design and optimize your main survey. So getting down to thinking about survey design and where we place lines or points across our study area. And the main idea is that we want to use randomly placed lines or points throughout our study area, simply because it's often impossible to cover the whole study area, so we need to survey a sample of it. And using a randomized design ensures that we take a representative sample of the whole study area. Now, even better, we might consider using a systematic grid of lines or points which have been randomly placed through the study area. And using a systematic grid that's been randomly placed actually helps with encounter rate variance above a purely randomized design. Linked to covering a representative part of our study area, we advise you not to use roads or tracks, as these are often placed in a non-random way through a study area, and so don't make for very good lines. And you can think about a stratified design if there are strong differences in habitat, for example, or you know ahead of time that you have differences in animal density through your study area. And we'll come on to why stratification can be a good idea in later slides in a little while. And another survey design principle when using lines is that we want to orientate lines perpendicularly to any density contours we know about, or to linear features such as a woodland edge or a coastline. And again, we'll talk about why that's a good idea in later slides. And finally, many short lines are often preferred to a few long lines. This can help with our encounter rate variance, and again, we'll talk about some examples later on. So thinking about some point transect survey design ideas, here you can see a study area with a systematic grid of points placed in it. But if we back up a little and consider a simple random design, we could take the following approach. We could create a grid of squares across the whole study area, and if we take W to be the detection radius of a point. We could use squares with side 2w in this case. And then we can take a random sample of those grid cells, and that will tell us where to place points in the study area. Now, the use of the grid means that no 2 points will overlap. However, because this is a purely randomized design, you can see that in this case we have points that are placed very closely together, and also areas of our study area that are not sampled at all. And so whilst this is randomized, we might think about using a systematic design instead. And here are a few examples of a systematic design. And here we're using systematically placed lines in order to help us determine where to place points. So here we have 2 study areas, both have had lines placed through them, and points have then been placed along those lines. Now, you can see that the spacing of the points, although equally spaced along each line, differs between the design on the left-hand side and the one on the right-hand side. And you can see that the points on the left-hand side are clustered more closely together than the ones on the right. And so what this means is that when we come to think about our encounter rate variance and what do we consider to be the sampling unit in this case, on the left-hand design we would consider that the points on each line cannot be treated independently. They can't be treated as independent sampling units. And so what we'd actually do in the left-hand case is treat each line and the points on each line as the sampling units. Now, on the right, we have a spacing of points such that we could use each individual point as a sampling unit. And again, this is beneficial for encounter rate variance estimation. So, thinking a little bit about line transect designs, here we have an example of lines placed perpendicularly to a density gradient. And so we've got X denoting animals, and you can see that there's a north-south gradient here. So we have more animals in the north, fewer in the south. And our lines have been placed perpendicularly to that gradient. And what that means is that each line will cut through an area of high density and of lower density, which should even out the encounter rates on each of those lines, which will help with lowering the encounter rate variance in our analysis. So that's why placing these lines perpendicularly through gradients is a good idea. Now, similarly to when we were thinking about the point transect designs, you could start off with a simple random design. And here's an example where we've now got a grid of rectangles, each with width 2w and of length L. And those rectangles have been placed across the study area, and a simple random sample has been taken of those rectangles and lines placed within those rectangles, and that's the study design. But again, like the points, you can see that we have lines placed close together, and logistically this might not be an optimal design for you. So we can think about instead a systematic design. So here we've got segments again, short lines placed through the study area, but now you can see they've been systematically placed. And the distance between them is similar in a north-south and an east-west direction. So these segments could be treated as independent sampling units, as we've discussed before. Now you'll also notice sometimes these segments, similarly to points, might intersect the boundary of your study area. And you can see some examples there of the dotted lines denoting segments that cut across the boundary. In the next lectures we'll talk about ways to deal with that and some of the rules that you might use to overcome those edge effects, as they're called when they occur. Here's another example of a design. This is known as a circuit design. And again, this might be useful for logistical reasons. You can see that we've had multiple circuits have been placed systematically through this study area. And then the nice thing about a circuit design is once you get to a particular circuit, you can complete the line and get back to a starting point, and maybe that's useful for some reason. Again, some of those circuits have fallen on the boundaries of the study area, and again we'll talk about how to deal with those edge effects in a later lecture. Now, thinking about logistical reasons can be a really important part of survey design, and the sawtooth or zigzag design is used to remove transit time between lines which would otherwise waste fuel, for example, so it can improve the efficiency of a survey. So here, the transit lines have been joined to create zigzags, which means there's no time off effort travelling between separate lines. Another feature of a zigzag design, as you can see here, is that a ship, for example, might move through one set of zigzags, but then can actually turn around and repeat a complementing set of zigzags through the study area. So again, it can help to create the most efficient and optimal design for your study. Now, whichever survey design you choose, there are details to think about, and so one example of something to think about is how we deal with corners in some of these more unusual designs. So here's an example. Here we have a circuit design, and we have an animal X has been detected up here near one of the corners. And the question is, which line of the circuit should that animal be associated with? And so here's one example of a rule that can be used. We can say that animal X was detected in trapezium A, and therefore that animal belongs to line segment B. And the chapters that I mentioned have examples of many of these rules that can be used in these surveys. Here's another way to deal with corners. So here the circuit design has been adjusted slightly so that the circuit line segments don't meet, but it makes it very clear if animals were detected in various parts of the surveyed area, which lines they should be associated with. And so survey design can get a little complicated just because the areas you're interested in surveying are variable. And so here you can see an example of a way to design an inshore survey. So we have the land and the coastline here, and the way to get around the corner of the coastline is to create two survey regions or two strata, and to place the lines perpendicularly to the animal gradient that's evident within each of those regions. So here is an example of a real survey designed around Iceland for cetaceans using aeroplanes. And there are a few things to note here. Firstly, you can see that perpendicular lines to the coastline have been used in the inshore waters, and then a zigzag design has been used in the waters further offshore. You'll also notice that there's a lot more effort placed in the inshore waters compared to the lines in the offshore waters. And this was because it was known ahead of time that the density of whales was likely to be higher in the inshore waters, and so more effort was placed in the inshore waters through the stratified design. And as we'll discuss later, it's a way to help reduce variance across the survey. Now I can show you that was the designed survey, and this is what actually happened with the realised effort for the survey. And so you can see that in the real world it's not always possible to complete your design, but as long as you have a record of where the effort was placed, that's a really important thing to have. You'll notice here that there's a big gap in the top left-hand corner of this survey. And if we go back to the original design, you can see this black dotted line, and that actually denotes the ice edge near Iceland. And so the gap in effort here is simply that there was ice cover in this area, and therefore the survey couldn't take place. So I mentioned stratification, and you just saw an example of a stratified design. And so why stratify? And there are several reasons why it might be a useful thing to do. So as I just mentioned, it's a way to improve precision. And so by using a stratified design, you actually estimate the interstratum differences rather than have the difference between them contribute to the overall variance of your analysis. And you can actually reduce the overall variance by increasing effort in the strata which contribute most to the variance. So, as with the Iceland survey, more effort was placed in those inshore waters where density was suspected to be higher. Secondly, there might be reasons why you want to estimate by subregion or by stratum. And so there might be managerial reasons why it's useful to know about stratum A compared to stratum B. And finally, for logistical reasons. You have a finite amount of resources, and so creating a stratified design where you place less effort in areas with suspected lower density, for example, might be a way to optimize your resources and get the most out of your survey. So now we understand why stratification might be a useful thing to do. We need to consider what we can actually stratify. And so you could consider estimating encounter rate per stratum, and that could be linked to densities that vary spatially. You could consider producing detection functions per stratum. Again, detection functions could vary spatially if you had different habitat, for example. But you have to be aware that there are sample size limitations if you do want to estimate separate detection functions per stratum. Similarly, you could think about producing stratified estimates of mean cluster size. Cluster size could also vary spatially, but again, you have to think about, do you have enough data per stratum to generate those individual mean cluster size estimates? And something else to think about is if you don't produce these estimates for each separate stratum, but pool your data across strata, but then go on to generate within stratum density estimates. If any of those three things do differ between strata, but you've estimated them pooling across strata, you have to be aware that within stratum estimates could potentially be biased. So it's just a little bit of a warning to say, while stratification can be a really useful thing to do, you have to be aware of its limitations and how you appropriately analyze stratified data. So we're just finishing up with an example of a stratified analysis, and these are some of the things that you might come up against. So here we have some information about Risso's dolphin distribution off the coast of Washington and Oregon in the US. And you can see that most animals are between the 200 meter and 2000 meter depth contour. You can see dots distributed not really close inshore, but equally not so far offshore. So if you were designing a survey, the question would be, well, do I put more survey effort into that shelf edge and create a shelf edge stratum? But you have to consider, if you put too much effort into that one stratum, will you end up with a too low a sample size in the other strata? And quite often people think about doing multi-species surveys. So in this case, what would happen to the other species? Are they distributed in a similar way or not? And so here's an example of harbour porpoise distribution in the same area. And here you can see that the harbour porpoise have a very inshore distribution. And so creating a stratified survey for Risso's dolphins might not be the optimal approach for harbour porpoise. And so a good idea if you've got a multi-species survey set up is to consider using uniform effort across strata. Another thing to be aware of with stratified designs is that if your coverage differs among the spatial strata, you lose pooling robustness, which is, as has been discussed in previous lectures, is a really useful feature of distance sampling. And in order to retain pooling robustness, you need to have uniform effort across strata. And with that, that's the end of this first survey design lecture.